Thank you for joining Wars of the Rosies as we continue with Part 2, Alchemical Foundations, from the Orders of the Great Work by Manly P. Hall. The Adepts, Orders of the Great Work. Alchemical Foundations. The foundation of alchemy must be examined both traditionally and historically. Often it is difficult to estimate correctly the factual elements involved in the origin and descent of arts and sciences. Most of the essential branches of learning emerge into the light of sober recording at a comparative late date, and when the subjects themselves are well advanced in both theory and practice. Actually, we have no adequate knowledge of the beginning of mathematics, astronomy, music, medicine, or chemistry. These divisions of man's thoughtful inquiries about life and living are rooted in a dark, unknown earth, and emerge from the prehistorical sphere of legendary to bear their fruit in the light of historical times. The traditional account of the origin of chemistry involves a number of extravagant pretensions. Alchemy was included in the curriculum of the College of the Angels, which Adam attended in paradise before the fall. Moses and Aaron were instructed in the mystery of transmutation by God himself, and became great adepts in the secrets of the stone. When the angels descended to take wives from among the daughters of men, as recorded in the book of Enoch, they revealed to mortals the precious chemistry for the regeneration of elements. According to another account, the fallen angels, out of revenge, taught men the art of gold making, realizing that wealth would impede the progress of the human soul. The later Egyptians believed that alchemy was revealed to mankind by the god Thoth, lord of the mind and secretary of nature. Thoth emerged as the initiate priest-king, Hermes Trismegistus, or thrice greatest. Very little is known about this obscure adept, who has been honored as the founder of the Hermetic arts. It is a moot question in the minds of many historians as to whether he really existed as a great philosopher, or whether he was a symbolic personification of a secret doctrine of chemistry, guarded by the priest of the Egyptian mysteries. For centuries, the term Hermetic has been confused with alchemy or magic. Actually, the Hermetic art is theurgy, the science of the perfection of man through internal illumination. Most of the alchemical writers of the medieval period refer to the old legends as true and faithful reports, but proof is completely lacking. Scarcely any of the illustrious prophets and sages of old times are omitted from the traditional list of philosophic chemists. Numerous books, presumably by these remote authors, were circulated throughout Europe, the Near East, and North Africa. We are justified in assuming that reference to any extraordinary antiquity for alchemical speculation should be regarded as allegorical or fabulous rather than literal. Even the origin of the word alchemy is disputed. The prefix al suggests an Arabic source, and the Arabs, especially the mystical sects, which flourished among them, were enthusiastic exponents of the art. The second syllable, chemi, is reminiscent of the Egyptian chem, and the hieroglyphic chimai, which signifies dark earth, and, by extension, simply darkness or blackness. Old authors refer to alchemy as the science of the Egyptians, the dark or hidden art. It is not unreasonable, therefore, that the Egyptian word chemi could have given us our modern word chemistry, and that the prefix al forming alchemistry or alchemy properly means God chemistry or divine chemistry, or more generally, the divine art. The basic axiom of alchemy is that man prefers nature through art. Art is the wisdom to know and the skill to do. Wisdom perfects art, and art perfects wisdom. And wisdom perfected by art is the wise man's stone. He who possesses it is master of the world. From Symbola Aurea Mensi, etc. Hermes pointing to the mystery of the stone. Here the solar and lunar principles are represented, united by the philosophical fire. Actually, the same uncertainty surrounds the source of mystical chemistry that shrouds the reorganization of the esoteric schools in the early Christian world. There does not seem to be any solid body of Western records referring to alchemy earlier than the 1st century AD. It is possible that prior to this time the subject was included among the arena of the mysteries. If so, the secret was well kept in spite of the hints and intimations to the contrary. Philosophical chemistry appears for the first time as a subject of general interest in the spheres of Hellenic influence in Syria and South Africa. The art was brought to the attention of a disbelieving world by the Greek and Syrian schools in Alexandria. The 2nd and 3rd centuries AD cover the period of this first flowering. These circumstances are involved in the decline of the pagan mysteries and the gradual rise of the North African Christian communities. The Gnostics and the Neoplatonists undoubtedly contributed to this emergence. There is every indication that philosophical alchemy developed among the initiates of the pagan mysteries, abetted by the heretical Christian sects that refused to acknowledge the authority and teachings of the early church. It was convenient, even at that time, to circulate the report that alchemy was already an ancient and honored art. Unless new discoveries change the complexion of things, we may say that the first cycle of alchemical literature extended from the 2nd to the 10th century AD. These date boundaries cannot be shifted by report alone, but must remain until codices bearing directly upon the subject and actually written prior to this time are identified with certainty. It is sufficient to point out that this stream of philosophical chemistry followed the same course as that of the heretical doctrines of the Manichaeans, the Gnostics, and the Neoplatonists. For practical purposes, we may regard alchemy as part of the great heresy against which the Church thundered its anathemas. Works considerably older than the alchemical writings are known dealing with physical chemistry, especially with the compounding of medications, the making of alloys, and the fusing of synthetic gems. A lead-glass composition called paste, used in making imitation stones of unusual brilliance, was developed and became popular throughout the Roman Empire. Religious signets made of this paste, belonging to the Gnostics, the Chaldeans, and other philosophical communities, occur with considerable frequency. Such productions, however, or ancient writings relating to them, cannot be said to be legitimate monuments of alchemy. It is possible that synthetic gems sometimes passed as genuine stones to the profit of the lapidary. He may have gained some reputation for cleverly imitating valuable metals and stone and jewels, but such imposture has no direct bearing on the alchemical art. If, as some students believe, alchemy was practiced in China at a slightly earlier period than it appears in the West, it is possible that it reached North Africa from Eastern Asia. The Taoist priests indulged in philosophical speculations which paralleled closely the premises of the European mystic chemist. The Chinese had their esoteric drug for the prolonging of human life. From their commentaries, however, it appears that this drug symbolized a state of consciousness by which the Tao, or the infinite reality, was experienced or possessed inwardly. To become one with Tao was to rest in an eternal state beyond change or dissolution. Thus, to these Eastern mystics, alchemy was the science of yoga, or union with the divine. In a sense, this was also the burden of Neoplatonism. The art of transmuting metals and the preparation of universal medicines were also cultivated, and professors of alchemy enjoyed imperial favor during the Tang dynasty. The 8 immortals of Taoism were regarded as possessing the secrets of immortality, boundless wealth, and a variety of supernatural powers. After the rise of Buddhism in China, the alchemical speculations of these Asiatics included elements of Buddhist metaphysics. As always, the perfection of man himself was the principal end. Dr. Obed Simon Johnson has noted that the Chinese have a record that in the year 166 AD, an embassy dispatched from Rome by the Emperor Antonius Marcus Aurelius was received in China for the purpose of establishing a commerce between these nations. Dr. Johnson summarizes his conclusion thus: the fact that these alchemical ideas first made their appearance in the West at some period, from the 3rd to the 5th century of this era, is of peculiar interest. At that time, Alexandria was still a mighty intellectual center, and even with the gradual decline of the Roman Empire, the city remained a commercial metropolis, second in importance only to Rome itself. A large portion of the Chinese trade, both by land and sea routes, passed through Alexandria, with the constantly increasing number of Oriental trades frequenting Alexandria. It is but natural that many ideas imported from the Orient should find congenial soil for growth in this center of culture and intellect. There seems to be no reason why the alchemical ideas of China, already well developed at the beginning of the Christian era, should not have reached Alexandria by the trade routes, to appear again after some transformation in Greek garb, and in an Occidental city. While a sinologist may opine differently, it is equally possible that both China and India were indebted to North Africa for elements of their magical chemistries. Usually we find that structures of religious, moral, and ethical convictions date themselves, not only by their internal content, but also by the way in which they develop their basic premises. The philosophy of alchemy is a direct and natural outgrowth of Plato's vision of the philosophic empire and the philosopher king. The possibility of a universal reformation of human institutions and the regeneration of man himself by the disciplines of wisdom revealed a larger and fuller purpose for mortal existence. At first, this vision was in the keeping of a few initiated idealists. Society as a whole was not inclined to such lofty speculations, but that small group, endowed with larger capacities, had discovered a sufficient reason for a long-range program of coordinated endeavor. If alchemy found enthusiastic acceptance among the transcendentalists of North Africa, it was received with still greater satisfaction and acclaim by the philosophers and mystics of Arabia. Reaching the Arabs from Grecian sources, alchemy remained for a time in the Arabian desert, only to return to Europe in the refined and polished productions of Eastern Romantic faking. Thus, many of the celebrated texts of the alchemical art are translations from the Persian and the Arabic. After the collapse of the pagan Rome Empire and the rise of the Christian Church, the Near East became the asylum of the cultured and the informed. Europe was plunged into the chaos of the Dark Ages, but the caliphs of Baghdad continued to bestow their patronage upon scientists and scholars. During the reign of Harun al-Rashid and his equally illustrious son, Al-Mamun, the genuine writings of Plato and Aristotle were translated into the Arabian language. Works composed by Alexandrian intellectuals found a special favor among the Arabs. The principal alchemical texts appealed to the dramatic instincts of the Israelites, and experiments in gold making became a popular diversion. Needless to say, the sober texts of the Greek and Egyptian scholars were ornamented with garlands of Arabic overtones and implications, until the most exact sciences took on the qualities of the Arabian Nights' entertainment. Among the illustrious adepts of the alchemical art who flourished among the Arabs should be mentioned Geber, Razis, Farabi or Al-Farabi, and Avicenna. These men lived between the 8th and 11th centuries AD and belong to what has been described as the alchemical period of Islamic culture. They contributed extensively to the foundations of Western chemical research and were respected as distinguished experimentalists. Francis Beretta refers to Geber as the prince of those alchemical adepts who had appeared during the Christian era. The distinguished Belgian chemist Jan Baptista von Helmont speaks of this celebrated Arab as the oracle of medieval chemists. As Hippocrates stands in the history of medicine, medieval biographers attributed nearly 500 scientific, philosophic, and hermetic tracts and treatises to Geber. He studied under several distinguished masters and probably perfected his knowledge of alchemy, mysticism, and the occult arts after his initiation into the Sufi order. Geber belongs in the direct descent of the Greek schools. which he may have contacted through Persian editors and compilers. Many tracts of esoteric subjects circulated under his name. In Europe are spurious, but he was a man of extraordinary erudition and skilled in the preparation of elixirs, the perfection of metals, and the production of synthetic gems. In his youth, Raziz showed slight promise of distinction. He gained some prominence in music, but devoted most of his time to the luxury and dissipation for which his generation was famous. After his 13th year, he dedicated his life to medicine and philosophy, traveled extensively, and gained practical experience as superintendent of the hospital at Baghdad. He interested the Prince of Khurasan in alchemical researches, but when the transmutation of metal was unsuccessful, the prince beat the physician over the head with a heavy alchemical book. It is reported that Raziz became blind as a result of this violence. He left a number of writings which were used in the universities of Europe as late as the 17th century, and his works were consulted and frequently referred to by the great Avicenna. He died in poverty, having given most of his goods to the poor. The life of Farabi has been embellished with numerous legends. He was of Turkish extraction, educated in Baghdad, where he studied the Greek philosophers, and was for a time the disciple of a Christian physician renowned for logic. Farabi traveled the greater part of his life, spent some time in Egypt, and made outstanding contributions to astronomy, mathematics, and music. He made a pilgrimage to Mecca and was entertained in the court of the Sultan of Syria. He devoted his entire life to learning and had the reputation for acquaintance with 70 languages and dialects. Some say that he died at the court of the Sultan, and others report that he was attacked and killed by robbers on one of his journeys. Farabi wrote of the Philosopher's Stone and other alchemical mysteries, and was considerably influenced by the teachings of the Neoplatonists. Although Avicenna, like Paracelsus, was said to have lived an intemperate and erratic life, his genius has been accorded universal recognition. At an early age, he perfected his mind in mathematics, and then devoted himself to philosophy, psychology, and Neoplatonic transcendentalism. He had the courage to attempt a systematization of the categories of Aristotle, a project flavoring of audacity. In his 16th year, Avicenna approached the study of medicine and was fortunate enough to cure many influential persons, including members of the ruling house. He became Grand Vizier, but was more interested in his studies of the philosophic mercury and the materia prima of the stone than the dreary concerns of public office. Medieval European translations of Avicenna were standard texts in the universities and medical colleges. He had stature as a magician, and many grimoires and rituals of sorcery are attributed to him. The Arabs believed that the physician commanded a legion of spirits and was served by jinn. According to tradition, as he sought the philosophic stone, several Oriental peoples affirmed him to be still alive, dwelling in splendid state, invested with spiritual powers, and enjoying in an unknown retreat the sublime nectar of perpetual life and the rejuvenating qualities of the arum potable. The alchemical tradition contains all the elements of the world program of enlightenment and reform. It requires only a superficial acquaintance with the philosophy and literature of alchemy in order to sense the magnitude of this concealed project. Had it been simply a science for the transmutation of metals, there would have been no need for the masters of the art to depart from Christendom and to take refuge in Islam. Had these adepts been Orthodox Christian chemists, they would scarcely have been received so hospitably by the Arabs. The very fact that the Knights of the Golden Stone found sanctuary in pagan communities still dominated by Hellenic scholarship should in itself reveal the truth of the matter. For several centuries, the Christian and pagan institutions were engaged in mortal conflict. In a curious way, Christianity also was attempting to establish the Platonic Commonwealth. The pagans rejected the machinery of the church because they felt that it imposed unreasonable and unnatural restrictions upon the human mind, and that the clergy was resolved to dominate utterly the New World Order. The non-Christian communities functioned from the premise that only a truly enlightened man could administer himself and his world effectively. Enlightenment required self-discipline and a broad, deep program of education. The Christians were thinking in terms of a priest-king, ruling in glory by divine right. The pagans were thinking in terms of a philosopher king, a gentle and wise teacher ruling by the love and consent of the governed. If we consider nature as a sphere of instincts and impulses, then art becomes the method by which unorganized potential is integrated and directed. The pagans were not so much given to miracles as their Christian counterparts. The Neoplatonists, for example, preferred to think of man accomplishing much with the help of God, rather than God accomplishing much with a little assistance grudgingly given by his children. If humankind longed for the paradise to come, it was up to them to earn a better state for themselves and for those who came after them. The only honorable way to earn was to grow. Growth alone, as the result of consecrated endeavor, proved to the gods that man deserved happiness and security. The alchemical laboratory became the shrine of the spiritual sciences, taking the place of the ruined sanctuaries of the ancient mysteries, which had been defiled by war, pillage, and the corruption of priesthoods. It was no longer possible to protect the physical houses of initiation. With the decline of the temporal power of pagan states, the hereditary descent of priestly officers became dangerous and impractical. One by one, the shrines were sought out and demolished, and legislation enacted to prevent their re-establishment. It became unsafe even to be suspected of addiction to classical philosophy, but wise men cannot be outwitted by stupid laws, and it would be foolish to assume that a structure of learning thousands of years old could be completely dissolved by a few unreasonable edicts. The initiate philosophers simply transferred their temples, shrines, sanctuaries, and palaces to a less tangible but equally real sphere of action. They rebuilt their empire along the shores of the air, that is, on the place of the mind, substituting psychological association for physical fraternities. Their enemies could not attack successfully these airy fortresses, and the old wisdom continued to permeate the social structure from within. The mystery teaching emerged under a variety of symbols, emblems, and figures. It took up its abode in the very camp of its adversaries, gradually transmuting all other doctrines into the likeness of itself. It became the universal Proteus, taking on all appearances at will, yet never revealing its own shape. This invisible empire was beyond the reach of the profane. Occasionally one of the citizens, meaning initiates, was apprehended and destroyed, but another immediately filled the vacancy. The machinery of the Inquisition was set in motion against the empire of the sages, but persecution alone strengthened the resolution of these unknown philosophers. Alchemy was one of the earliest appearances of the mystery schools in early Christian Europe. The contrivance was most adroit. It appealed to the ideals of the idealist and the avarice of the avaricious. It catered to the whims of princes and to those dreams of inexhaustible wealth which have always intrigued the foolish. Later, when these alleged gold makers were solemnly pronounced insane, this very cloak of madness served useful purposes. It was a medieval conviction that the insane were under the special protection of God, and to persecute them was contrary to the divine will. In fact, there are many instances in which the states, hoping to replenish their treasuries, supported colonies of philosophers in some luxury for years, allowing them privileges of assembly and freedom of conviction denied other groups. The alchemical tradition was largely restricted to the areas around Byzantium and the Eastern Mediterranean until the rise of Islamic culture in Spain in the 8th century. The Arabs brought with them a mass of scientific literature rooted in the Greek and Syrian cults. They placed special emphasis upon medicine and chemistry, and they led inevitably to philosophical speculation, especially where physical data was insufficient. Scholars of Western Europe, studying in the colleges of the Moors, translated most of the popular texts into the atrocious Latin of the period and distributed them widely among the universities and cloister schools. The resulting surge of mystical thinking did much to break up the crystallization that was threatening the survival of Western European education. Alchemists drifted about Europe for centuries, comparatively unmolested, except that every means was used to induce them to reveal their gold-making secrets. It was not even profitable to rack them too frequently, lest they die in the torture chamber and their priceless formulas be lost. Some, too boastful or imprudent, came to tragedy, but the majority was publicly ridiculed and privately cultivated. Even unbelievers, heretics, and Muslims were tolerated by the Orthodox if there were some hope of future gain. In time, these alchemists drew about themselves strong groups of liberals and fashioned an elaborate underground system that eventually weakened the superstructures of ecclesiastical and political tyranny. Albertus Magnus, who was canonized by Pope Pius XI in 1932, enumerated 8 rules or conditions to be observed by those seeking the Philosopher's Stone. The alchemist should cultivate discretion and silence. He should reside in a private house in an isolated situation. He should select the time for his labors with discretion. He should practice patience, diligence, and perseverance. He should obey implicitly the rules of science. He should use only vessels of glass or glazed earthenware. He should have sufficient means to bear the expenses of his research, and he should carefully avoid association with princes or nobles. From these rules, it may be inferred that the chemist was engaged upon a program that required complete devotion, dedication, and freedom from outside interferences. As the alchemical tradition unfolded, the devotees of the art fell into 3 distinct classes. The first group was made up of physical chemists, firmly convinced that the actual transmutation of metals were possible, thereby assuring worldly wealth. These gold makers took their art so seriously that one offered to finance the Crusades and another volunteered to pay off the national debt of his country. George Ripley, a 15th century alchemist, having discovered the Philosopher's Stone, contributed £100,000 to the Knights of Rhodes so that they could continue the war against the Turks, to prevent the upheaval which promiscuous transmutation might create in the monetary system. Several governments, including England, enacted laws against the manufacture of gold, except under the supervision of the officers of the mint. The second group, composed of mystical chemists, raised its voice in protest against the gold makers, declaring alchemy to be a spiritual science of regeneration completely apart from all selfish material interest. To these savants, transmutation was a Eucharist sacrament, and alchemy was a sacred art devoted to interpreting the mysteries of God through a Kabbalah of chemical symbols and formulas. Bema and Kunarath certainly held this position, and quotations from Roger Bacon and Basil Valentine support the same conviction. The third group, philosophically inclined, attempted to unite these opposing concepts and to establish a common ground. The artist of this group responds thus: nature is both spiritual and material. That which is true spiritually of invisible things must also by analogy be true physically of visible things. The physical transmutation of metals proves the possibility of the spiritual transmutation of man. Each in its own sphere justifies the other. If metals can be purified, man can be regenerated. Alchemy and chemistry are one art manifesting in 2 worlds, an inner world of divine mystery and an outer world of natural mystery. Naturally, the motion of the Renaissance, sweeping across from Byzantium and touching, like the first rays of the rising sun, the great cities of Italy and France, brought with it the philosophy of alchemy. The obvious consequence of the Renaissance was the Protestant Reformation. Was not the Reformation a byproduct of these humanistic teachings which had kept alight the altar fires of the old mysteries? The Reformation made possible the advancement of the arts and sciences and the liberation of the human mind. from a sterile scholasticism. This liberation in its turn made possible the rise of modern democratic institutions and the reinstatement of the concepts of the philosophic empire. The rights of man, long taught secretly, could now be publicly proclaimed. Most men are too prone to think in terms of providence and accidents. Growth is one of those inevitable processes to be taken for granted. Actually, the gradual release of the human mind from complete servitude to infallible doctrines was the result of tireless effort carried on secretly by groups well aware of the importance of their task. Nothing happens by accident except disaster. All progress is by intent. We should hold in the highest regard and esteem those hidden powers behind the visible powers that change the world. After the advent of Paracelsus, the outer form of the alchemical tradition passed through an important modification. The real purpose of the gold makers was gradually and cautiously revealed. Although a certain amount of discretion was still necessary, the mysticism of alchemy, its Kabbalistic associations, its involvement in esoteric astrology, and its indebtedness to the learning of ancient peoples and distant countries was allowed to become evident. The secret tradition in alchemy, with its divine science of human regeneration and redemption, was indicated through the enlargement and extended use of symbols and emblems. The spiritual mystery finally was so thinly veiled as to be almost immediately obvious. At the same time, several parallel groups dedicated to the same ends, but using different means, were merged to form the Confederation of Initiated Philosophers, which came into prominence in the opening years of the 17th century. An ethical sphere was inserted between the worlds of God and nature. This middle ground was human society. The institutions set up by men were in desperate need of transmutation. The foundations of alchemy shifted, and the abstract symbolism was applied to the transformation of corrupt governments, thus preparing the way for the emergence of a democratic, socialized way of life. In time, the mystic chemists became mystic politicians. They bound themselves into a secret empire of philosophical reformers. Through them, magical, Kabbalistic, and transcendental lore was focused upon the practical task of the restoration of the Golden Age. This Golden Age was the symbol of the philosophic empire. A remarkable book on philosophical alchemy, titled A Suggested Inquiry Concerning the Hermetic Mystery in Alchemy, being an attempt to recover the ancient experiment of nature, was published anonymously in London in 1850. This work was almost immediately withdrawn from circulation, a circumstance given rise to numerous speculations. The original edition of this book is now extremely rare. The truth of the matter seems to be that the authoress, a Mrs. Sarah Atwood, was closely related to a prominent Anglican clergyman who suspended the publication to prevent personal embarrassment. The book was later reissued with biographical notes and other details. A Suggestive Inquiry is probably the most valuable exposition of esoteric alchemy so far compiled. No one can pursue the text without becoming aware of the esoteric pattern underlying the operations of the mystical chemist. These old philosophers are revealed as sharing a body of secret learning best described as the science of sciences, or the master key, to the operations of nature under divine law. 7 years after the appearance of Mrs. Atwood's inquiry, an American author, General Ethan Allen Hitchcock, enlarging on a pamphlet issued 2 years earlier, published his Remarks Upon Alchemy and the Alchemist, etc., anonymously. General Hitchcock, though working from a limited biography, proceeded thoughtfully and arrived at several relevant conclusions as he realized that the symbolic language of the chemical adepts indicated more than an accidental meeting of minds. For example, there are many signs in alchemical volumes of secret societies, in which probably the language used was continually determined. I have at times thought that some members of the Masonic fraternity might have found the secret language of the alchemist a convenient mode of publishing, or rather of circulation among the initiated, doctrines of which they have taken an oath not to speak directly, or to make known exact to a brother. It is quite certain that books in a mysterious language were written by members of the Rosicrucian Society, who, I think it would be easy to show, had agreed to speak and write of each other before the uninitiated as sylph, fairies, elves, gnomes, and salamanders. The small volume under the title of Comte de Gabalis, I am persuaded, was written by a Rosicrucian, and exhibits something of the manner by which the members of that fraternity approached strangers and sounded them upon the subjects of becoming members. General Hitchcock concludes his investigation with the following summary. I have thus endeavored to show that alchemy, the name of the Hermetic philosophers in the Middle Ages, was religious philosophy or philosophic religion. The philosophy of alchemy is concerned with the mystery of the materia prima, or the first matter of life. The first matter is the chaos of the Orphics, space itself, within which takes place the mystery of creation. Space is the infinite potential, and its social equivalent is the human collective. The races and nations of mankind, engaged in an endless striving, abide in an ethical privation equivalent to chaos. As the supreme wisdom which creates all things brought cosmos out of chaos by impressing upon the elements the pattern of universal law, so must the plan of the philosophic empire be revealed in the political sphere. Human society is then the base metal to be transmuted. The great masters of alchemy declared that the seeds of gold are present in all natural substances. Augmentation is the releasing of the universal energy in these seeds, not the creation of gold, but the growth of this precious metal. Growth is hastened by art. The tree of the philosophers, bearing its 12 kinds of fruit, is the soul tree of Jakob Weimar. This German mystic wrote that the seed of God is planted in the human heart, nourished by holy aspiration, prayer, meditation, and the contemplation of the mysteries of the Spirit. This seed grows miraculously, and its fruit feeds those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. The artist is the master of the secret of natural growth. He uses no artificial means, for if he does, the results cannot be permanent. He becomes a secretary over nature, a guardian of the sleeping gold. He must preserve this treasure against the vandalism of men and the corruption of false doctrines. Like Vulcan and Prometheus, he guards the sacred flame that is necessary to work the metals. The philosophic fire is the same that burned in the adytum of ancient sanctuaries. The fire chemist is descended from the mighty smithy, Tubal Cain, the iron worker, who pounded swords into plowshares. He belonged to the clan of that cunning artisan, our father, Charon, who cast the golden implements of the Temple of Solomon, the king. The literature of alchemy forms in itself the material for a fascinating study. Unfortunately, little consideration has been given to this class of books and manuscripts. True enough, very few of the old scrolls and vellums were the works of trained artists. Although many show a measure of artistic ability, their value lies principally in their extraordinary symbols and emblems. The recent research of Carl Jung indicates the psychological importance of the alchemical writings and diagrams. The keepers of the lamp have kept their trust for more than 15 centuries, and they were long, dark, dismal centuries. The day for a larger revolution has struck, and the time is approaching when the institutions dedicated to the ends of the philosophic empire can reappear in the objective world. It would be a mistake, however, to assume that the need for secrecy and caution has come to an end. the body of human society is still not strong enough to carry the full weight of its own regeneration. A broad program of educational reform must prepare the individual for his citizenship in the world commonwealth. As long as tyranny in any of its forms and appearances remain, secret assemblies must continue. Noble purposes entrusted to the keeping of the unenlightened are rapidly prevented and fail of usefulness. Today we think of alchemy as the mad mother of chemistry. We grudgingly acknowledge that to the old alchemists we are indebted for many choice secrets, remedies, and compounds. Actually, chemistry is older than alchemy, in the sense that it existed long before it became the medium for the perpetuation of the esoteric doctrines. Chemistry began in magic, unfolded in philosophy, and finally emerged in the sober garb of science. Yet, without the keys reserved for the initiate, chemistry itself can never accomplish its true purpose. The undevout chemist, like the undevout astronomer, is mad. Until the restoration of the esoteric tradition, all the material arts and sciences are bodies without souls, physical ghosts in a spiritual universe. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Rosies. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.